Fellas, when it comes to UFC champions, the focus is always on who's the next contender, who's going to be the next contender to take on every champion. But I want to know about the all-time greats, so I've gone through every current UFC champion, and I've match-made them against some of the all-time greats in all of their weight class to kind of see how competitive these champions would be against some of the GOATs in the UFC. And we'll start off with the heavyweight division. Now, even though Jon Jones is the heavyweight champion, Aspinall's the best. Jones ain't fighting him for a reason. He's the most disputed champion in the UFC. I'm going Aspinall. Now, for the first fighter that I would put, or the first all-time great that I would put against Aspinall, has to be Stipe. I think most people would regard Stipe as the greatest heavyweight of all time, at least in the UFC anyway, so Aspinall versus Prime Stipe. Not the Stipe that fought Jon Jones at UFC 309, who should have been nowhere near an octagon. I'm talking about Prime Stipe Miocic, that was running the heavyweight division. Aspinall versus Prime Stipe. Now, ironically, the heavyweight division hasn't actually changed that much since Stipe last fought. Yes, there's different fighters, but you've still got the fat guys who pack a punch. You've still got the blobs who have somehow made it into the rankings. But between Aspinall and Prime Stipe, it's a tough fight for Aspinall. It's a dangerous fight because Stipe Miocic was just running through every heavyweight at the time like a hot knife through butter. Really good wrestling, even better boxing. Just found a way to beat every heavyweight at the time. But I don't know if that works against somebody like Tom Aspinall. When you go and watch the likes of Stipe and some of the other heavyweights, and then you go and immediately watch a Tom Aspinall fight, it's kind of crazy just how quick Tom Aspinall is. I know everybody says it, but when you really compare him to the other heavyweight fights, the other big heavyweight fights, he's so fast. I think Aspinall knocks out Stipe. I really do. I think the heavyweight division, I think Aspinall is just so far ahead of so many other heavyweights that we've seen. And let's be completely honest, even though the heavyweight division has still got similar fighters, if we talk about purely the top five today is way more competitive than the top five, in my opinion, when Stipe was around. And you've got Aspinall, who's the best today against Prime Stipe. Stipe is a tough guy. If he brings Aspinall into the later rounds, it could be difficult. I could see him somehow clipping Aspinall, but Prime Stipe versus Aspinall, just the speed difference and how well-rounded Aspinall is, I think he'd find a way to put Stipe out of there. I'm going to go Aspinall to win this one by knockout. Maybe you're going to say it's recency bias, but we've never seen a heavyweight like Tom Aspinall. But how would he do against Cain Velasquez, who is one of the most tough, dangerous heavyweights we've ever seen? Velasquez was an absolute mauler. He would take nearly every single heavyweight into deep waters. He had dangerous, powerful boxing, and his wrestling was some of the best we've ever seen in the UFC. This dude just absolutely mauled people. But Tom Aspinall's got good takedown defense. He's also got really good striking. But the problem with Aspinall is we don't know how he would look in deep waters because he's never been taken into deep waters. He's finished every single one of his fights in the first round and one of them in the second. But if Cain Velasquez is the first guy to take you into deep waters, that ain't a good sign because he does that perfectly and he would be an absolute mauler. Like, the last person you want to be taken into deep waters with is Cain Velasquez. I've got to go with Aspinall to win that by knockout. I know there's going to be comments spamming recency bias. I understand how dangerous Velasquez was, but if we're talking about current Tom Aspinall versus prime Cain Velasquez, I think Aspinall gets it done. I think he's not just one of these ploddy heavyweights that's going to walk forward and get taken down. He's light on his feet. He's always moving around. I think he'd find a way to clip Cain Velasquez. And it's not even like Aspinall necessarily has bad stamina. We don't know how bad his stamina is because we've never seen him go the distance. It's kind of a mystery at this point. Velasquez is dangerous. He's definitely stylistically one of the most dangerous heavyweights for Tom Aspinall, but Aspinall's different. He's so far ahead of the heavyweight division. I think he'd find a way to knock out Velasquez. And then for Francis Ngannou, two of the best heavyweights in the world right now. Aspinall's got the speed, and Ngannou's got the power. But the problem with Aspinall is he tends to get caught quite a bit against heavyweights. You can't afford to do that against Francis Ngannou. He's one of the hardest hitters in the hardest hitter in UFC history. And I know he's also got the grappling option as well, but Ngannou's showed that he's got some of the best takedown defense we've seen, especially in that Stipe rematch. They're both nightmare matchups for each other. It's a tough one to call because Aspinall's definitely got the speed advantage, the fastest heavyweight we've ever seen, and Ngannou's got the power, the most powerful heavyweight we've ever seen. Aspinall's got the takedown offense, and Ngannou's got the takedown defense. Aspinall's got the submission game, and Ngannou's got the strength and athleticism. They're both just such dangerous matchups for each other. I'd have to give it a 50-50. I can't confidently say that one of them beats each other because I can see Aspinall outclassing Ngannou, just about doing enough on the feet and maybe being able to hold his own when it comes to grappling. But I could also see Ngannou clipping Tom Aspinall with a big shot and Aspinall's chin not being able to take it. And Ngannou's got good grappling as well. His past couple of fights, all he's been doing is taking people down and mauling them. So it's a 50-50 fight, prime Ngannou versus current Aspinall, or prime Aspinall, I guess you can say. 50-50. I couldn't confidently say one of them beats each other, but one thing's for sure, Jones don't want any part of both of them, notoriously ducked them both. But then for Alex Pereira in the light heavyweight division, if we talk about the greatest light heavyweight of all time, it's got to be Jon Jones. I mean, he is the greatest light heavyweight of all time, but also the greatest of all time, most people would regard him. Now, Poatan, he's been on an absolute tear in the light heavyweight division, just beating every contender, but I don't know if that's going to work when you're facing Jon Jones, because there's been a lot of talk about Ankalaev being a grappling problem to Alex Pereira. If Ankalaev's a grappling problem, imagine what Jon Jones is going to be. The guy who has basically dominated nearly every single light heavyweight with his wrestling, shown that he's got some of the best jiu-jitsu game in the UFC. And even on the feet, I'm not saying he's a better striker, but he's good at keeping his distance. He's good at the oblique kicks and keeping people at range on the feet to avoid danger. Jones wins this one by submission. I mean, I could easily see him taking him down and slashing him with ground and pound, because we saw in Jones's early light heavyweight career how he just battered people with the ground and pound. Even if we're talking about a heavyweight Jon Jones versus current Alex Pereira, I think any Jon Jones beats Alex. It's a nightmare matchup. Porton's got inexperienced grappling. You're feeding him into a guy with some of the best wrestling in UFC history and just amazing ground game. I think Jones mauls Alex Pereira. I don't think it's super competitive. And then for the next greatest light heavyweight, which I will put as DC, Daniel Cormier. Oh, you thought Jon Jones' grappling is bad? Wait until you hear about DC's wrestling. I mean, unless Porton catches him coming in early on with like a knee or some sort of shot before DC initiates the grappling, DC would maul him. I think it goes similar to the Anthony Johnson fight. DC is one of the best wrestlers we've ever seen. He would pick up these big heavyweights as an undersized heavyweight and light heavyweights and just ragdoll them like they're a crash dummy. He was so good at wrestling, one of the best wrestlers ever. I think the way this fight would go is he'd take down Porton, pick him up, dunk him on his head, break a rib, pick him up, slam him, finish him with a TKO, and then the fight gets stopped. I don't think this would be a competitive fight in the slightest. I think Cormier does whatever he wants. I could see him taking down Alex Pereira and just absolutely battering him with the brutal ground and pound that he's got. I could maybe even see him having a submission against him. I mean, you're putting a guy in Alex Pereira, who out of all the UFC champions right now has the worst wrestling. He's known for having bad wrestling, against arguably the best wrestler or one of the best wrestlers the UFC have ever seen. I think Cormier destroys Alex Pereira. Unless Porton catches him early, it's a wrap. It's arguably the biggest nightmare matchup in the light heavyweight division's history for Alex Pereira. I'm going DC. And then for Chuck Liddell, a pioneer of the UFC, an OG in the light heavyweight division in his time, he was the best. He was knocking out every single light heavyweight in his prime. But we're talking about a guy who was in his prime in 2006 versus the most dangerous fighter in 2024. As good as Liddell was, Porton destroys him. I mean, the sport has changed too much. Porton's too far ahead of Chuck Liddell. It's not really a competitive fight. Porton clips him early, gets the job done. Chuck Liddell, great pioneer. The sport's changed too much. And then for the middleweight division with Dricus du Plessis, the first fighter we've got is Anderson Silva, the greatest middleweight of all time. I think this would be an interesting matchup because you've got that goofy style of Dricus du Plessis where he's very odd on the feet versus a laser-accurate Anderson Silva, who was one of the best strikers. But I will say, I know people like talking about how Silva dominated the middleweight division for a long time, but apart from maybe Vitor Belfort and Dan Henderson, I think Dricus du Plessis beats every single opponent that Anderson Silva did in his reign as well. It's quite a tough fight to pick because you've got Dricus du Plessis. I can see him being goofy on the feet, being a bit unorthodox, and Anderson Silva just being one of the greatest strikers of all time, just clips him with a big shot. But I can also see Dricus du Plessis getting dominated the entire fight, and then just pulling off a finish like he does. I think the safe option is Anderson Silva by knockout. Again, I know you can use the argument that the sport has changed and everything, but Dricus du Plessis, the guy's so wild, the guy's so unorthodox, he's not defensively sound. You're putting him against one of the most dangerous, a guy who was ahead of the middleweight division at his time, a guy who's one of the greatest strikers the UFC have ever seen in Anderson Silva. I think Silva somehow finds a shot to clip Dricus du Plessis with, and I think Anderson Silva would win by KO at some point in the fight, but it wouldn't surprise me if Dricus du Plessis did get the job done. And I'm not going to mention, obviously, Adesanya and Robert Whittaker, the other two greatest middleweights of all time, because Dricus has fought them both and finished them both. So I'm going to move on to Dan Henderson, one of the most tough middleweights we've ever seen in UFC history. Dan Henderson was a beast in his prime. That knockout over Michael Bisping, one of the most brutal knockouts in UFC history. He finished Fedor Emelianenko. He was just an absolute beast, was Dan Henderson. This dude must have hit like an absolute truck, he's almost like he was covered in metal armor with like knuckle duster, just battering people. And he had good grappling to top that off as well. His grappling wasn't even bad. He's shown that he's got good grappling throughout his entire career. It's a tough matchup, and again, we can talk about Dan Henderson's prime being in 2007 versus Dricus du Plessis' prime being in 2024. And Dricus du Plessis is a very goofy guy though. Like Darren Till nearly finished Dricus du Plessis. He's a very unorthodox striker, and we just said the whole argument of Anderson Silva being able to find the shot. If Anderson Silva can find the shot, I'm sure at some point in the fight, Dan Henderson would be able to find a shot. Prime Henderson would be able to time a shot on Dricus du Plessis. And I don't care how good you want to say Dricus' chin is, I don't think anyone can really just take a big shot from Hendo in his prime. I'm going Henderson by KO. Dan Henderson was an absolute monster. This dude hit like, he just had stone hands. He had iron hands. This dude had hit like a truck. and he was very good at setting up shots. You put him in against a goofy striker in Dricus du Plessis. As much as I want to say that the sport has evolved and Dricus is amazing, we're talking about Dan Henderson and Dricus. Stylistically, not a great fight for Dricus du Plessis. And then the next one we've got is Chris Weidman. You know, I wouldn't say he's one of the greatest of all time, but he's a big name, good legacy in the middleweight division, obviously. Obviously, former middleweight champion, beat Anderson Silva, the first guy to end Silva's reign, but he's a good wrestler with good ground and pound. He was just really well-rounded, was Chris Weidman, but I think Dricus du Plessis beats him comfortably. If he can finish Robert Whittaker on the feet, if he can take down and submit a guy who's good defensively, as well as Adesanya, and we've seen him in these 5-round wars with Sean Strickland, he can go the distance. As good as Chris Weidman was, I think Dricus du Plessis would find a way to TKO him. I've got no reason to pick Chris Weidman in this fight. After what I've seen by Dricus in these past 3 fights, I don't see why Chris Weidman would be a massive stylistic threat to Dricus du Plessis. I think Dricus gets the TKO. And then for Belal Muhammad in the welterweight division, the current champion with an underrated legacy, the first one we've got is the greatest welterweight of all time in GSP. A matchup that a lot of people have actually kind of talked about. Belal Muhammad, especially Prime Usman, against GSP. GSP in his prime, with the corner that he did, I think it was when he was facing Dan Hardy. I don't think any welterweight in history beats that dude. He was an absolute monster. He had dangerous striking. He was a wrestler that turned into this amazing... No, he was a striker that turned into an amazing wrestler throughout his time. And you've got Belal Muhammad, and I know Belal Muhammad's got good boxing, or at least he showed it in the Leon fight, but that's only because of the threat of the takedown, and Leon was worried about him getting taken down. That's not going to work against GSP, who's got good takedown defense, and who's who's a way better striker than Belal Muhammad. And you look at the Belal Muhammad fight with Leon Edwards the first time around, the no contest. Belal Muhammad was getting walked down and pressured, and was quite frankly losing that fight to Leon Edwards before he, obviously the eye poke took down. And you can't really compare Leon and GSP as well. Leon's takedown defense accuracy is 65% compared to GSP's 83%, which is crazy, because if you think of how long GSP's career was, to have an 83% takedown defense is insane, and he's got a way higher accuracy too. I'm going to go by GSP by decision. I know there's going to be that one dude in the comments that argues that Belal's better because of the style, you know, the wrestling that he's got, and the fact that he's got good boxing, and the sport has changed. GSP is one that has some of the best fight IQ we've ever seen, had some of the best game plans we've ever seen, and was quite frankly one of the most well-rounded dudes we've ever seen. I'm picking St. Pierre to win this one by decision. I don't think that should be necessarily a hot take, but Prime Usman versus Belal Muhammad. Now, I'm not talking about current Usman with a bad knees who's lost his past couple of fights. I'm talking about Prime Usman, the Nigerian nightmare, back in 2020 and 2021 when he was in his absolute prime. The one that had shown that he's got good wrestling. I mean, between the two of them, it's a tough matchup because Usman's got the wrestling as he showed it in the Woodley fight, as he showed it in the Leon fight. He had a very physical style of wrestling where he'd kind of use his strength to take people down. And Belal Muhammad, he's still got the strength, but he's more of a technical wrestler, pressures people, backs them up against the cage, and eventually lands the takedown and nobody can do anything. But we've seen Usman against Colby Covington, another wrestler, before, and he out-wrestled Colby Covington for the majority of both of their fights, and he had a good takedown defense. We've seen him against Tyron Woodley. He absolutely dominated Tyron Woodley with wrestlers. So we've seen Usman against wrestlers, whereas Belal, we haven't really seen him against a wrestler. We saw him against a 43-year-old Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu artist in Damian Maia, and 2 Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu guys who's mainly striking, Gilbert Burns and Sean Brady. We haven't seen this dude against a high-level wrestler, nowhere near close to the skill of Usman. And on the feet, it's not even close. Usman developed amazing striking throughout his title reign, knocking out Jorge Masvidal, dropped Colby Covington, broke his draw, knocked out Gilbert Burns as well. I think Usman wins this one by decision. I think he does a pretty good job at keeping it on the feet, pressuring Belal Muhammad, backing up against the cage, and just picking him apart on the feet, maybe even getting a finish across 5 rounds because of how heavy Usman's hands are. But I think I mean, if you're in a fight with Belal Muhammad and Usman, I think the obvious one to go for is a decision, but I'd go with Usman. I think he's more well-rounded, more powerful, stronger, and I think this is a stylistically really bad matchup for Belal Muhammad. I'm going Prime Usman to beat current Belal Muhammad. And then Belal Muhammad versus Matt Hughes. I'd say, yes, definitely one of the greatest welterweights of all time. Now, if Belal Muhammad thinks he's going to go in this fight and just get him in the clinch and outstrength him, you're wrong, because even though Belal Muhammad's got good wrestling and he's got good takedowns, Matt Hughes might be pound for pound the strongest fighter of all time. This dude was insanely strong for the welterweight division. People will always talk about it. GSP will talk about how it feels like you're getting manhandled by a light heavyweight. But I will say, he didn't have the best takedown defense, did Matt Hughes. As strong as he was, you put him against a technical wrestler, he always had a bit of a bad job. And his takedown defense is only 35%, which isn't that good. I think if you're putting him against current Belal Muhammad, he could get chinned. I could definitely see Belal Muhammad getting chinned by a big shot by Matt Hughes because of how powerful he is. But I think the fight would probably go with Belal Muhammad taking him down, dominating him with wrestling, and just basically getting a decision win because like I said, his takedown defense record's 35%. So. And on top of that, Matt Hughes peaked in 2006. You're talking about a guy who's in his prime in 2024. Completely different generations. I'm going Belal Muhammad by decision. I think he just takes down Matt Hughes the entire fight. dominates him, gets to control time. Boring Bilal Muhammad win, but I think he'd still get the win. And then for Makhachev, the best fighter currently in the UFC, let's see how we would do against Khabib, who most would argue is the second, some would say the #1 greatest lightweight of all time. Obviously, they'd never fight. They're training partners. They're kind of like always compared to each other because of how close their fighting style is. Well, not really their fighting style, but just how close their grappling is and how they kind of, you know, always with each other in the gym and stuff. But if we're talking about the two of them, it's tough because if you were to rank them by martial arts, wrestling, I'd give Khabib 10 out of 10 wrestling for the UFC standards. I'd give Makhachev 8 out of 10. I'd say Khabib was definitely a much more dominant wrestler. I mean, he'd take people down and find the submission within a couple of rounds. Makhachev, still an extremely dominant wrestler, but we've seen guys like Poirier able to defend the takedowns and get back up. But I would say Makhachev's the better striker. So if we do talk about striking, 7 out of 10 for Makhachev in comparison to 5 out of 10 for Khabib. Yeah, Makhachev's got pretty good boxing. I know he's got the threat of the takedown, but he's just always shown that he's a better striker than Khabib. Knocking out Alexander Volkanovski, you know, showing that he's got amazing striking his entire career. Khabib dropped Conor McGregor. That's his only striking highlight. But even then, that was with the massive threat of the takedown. And I think legacy-wise as well, I mean, you look at who Khabib's beaten. He's beat Poirier, Gaethje, and Conor McGregor. You can't really compare any of those to Makhachev in any sort of way, in terms of wrestling at least. I think Makhachev wins a decision. I think Khabib, as good as he was with the wrestling, I don't know if that's going to translate to beating Islam Makhachev, who I would say, if you compare the two of them, in the past couple of years, he's definitely the second best wrestler just behind Khabib. I think the fight would stay predominantly on the feet, Makhachev keeping the fight on the feet, and I think Makhachev would destroy Khabib on the feet. Khabib's never been a good striker. He's been, yes, he's a more dominant wrestler than Makhachev, but he's had this kind of weird striking style. He hasn't had the best striking. I think Makhachev keeps it on the feet. Not an easy fight, tough fight for him, but I think he'd just win the fight by striking and keeping the fight on the feet. And then for him versus BJ Penn, one of the greatest of all time. Now, BJ Penn in his prime was dangerous because he had jiu-jitsu, he had striking, he had wrestling, he had everything, did BJ Penn. One of the greatest of all time. Like, he just dominated in every area of every martial art. But again, his prime was 2008. You're comparing someone whose prime was in 2008 against someone whose prime is 2024. And not only just his prime is in 2024, he is the best fighter in the world in 2024. I mean, you can talk about BJ Penn being amazing, but quite frankly, I don't know if BJ Penn can even hold a candle compared to some of today's lightweights in the world. I think this fight would go to, I think Makhachev gets him in the clinch, takes him down, and probably finds a submission within a couple of minutes. I think Makhachev submits him. BJ Penn was amazing. He had good jiu-jitsu, good wrestling, but you're comparing him to Islam Makhachev. I mean, you're comparing him to Makhachev. I think he'd get him in the clinch, take him down within a couple of rounds and beat BJ Penn. The sport has moved on too much. Makhachev, probably the best lightweight we've ever seen in UFC history. So, as good as BJ Penn was and as good as his legacy is, I don't think he can get past Makhachev. And then for Frankie Edgar, again, one of the greatest of all time. I mean, just off the bat, Frankie Edgar was tiny for the lightweight division. You've seen, like, Makhachev's huge as well. We've seen photos where Edgar has been next to Makhachev. They look 3 weight classes apart. Now, obviously, this was when Edgar moved down to the featherweight division, but still, Makhachev towers over him. This would not be a competitive fight. Makhachev would take him down and maul him, and that's the story of the fight. As good as Edgar was, it ain't a close fight. Makhachev wins by ground and pound TKO. And then for Topuria in the featherweight division, let's talk about the greatest featherweight of all time, Jose Aldo. This is actually a fight that I don't see getting talked about enough. Obviously not, it doesn't make sense nowadays, but Prime Aldo versus current Topuria is really interesting because Prime Aldo dominated the featherweight division. Like, he absolutely dominated it. Nobody could come close to beating him. He had amazing striking. He was way quicker on the feet. He had punishing leg kicks, and he had solid takedown defense that he displayed throughout his entire UFC career. Laser accuracy. Now, Topuria does have one-shot KO power. He does have elite boxing, and he does have high-level grappling. But he does struggle. Like, I'm not that he struggles, but I will say in that Max Holloway fight, it seemed like Max Holloway was slightly doing the better on the feet between the two of them in that first round. I'd say Topuria still won the round because of their takedown, but Holloway was doing good on the feet in that first round. It's not like Topuria just absolutely dominates every fight from the first bell to the last. He might face some adversity early on and then he comes back. But against him and Aldo, I think he's got the boxing, Aldo's got the kicks, he's got the pressure, Aldo's got the counters, he's got the power, Aldo's got the speed, and he has the chin. He's got the grappling, Aldo's got the takedown defense. This is a really bad matchup for Topuria. I'm actually going to go with Jose Aldo winning this one by decision. I think Aldo just picks him apart on the feet. I really do. I understand how good Topuria is with his boxing and everything, but I don't think Aldo's just going to let him pressure him against the cage. Aldo's got a really good chin, and he's defensively really sound. He's faster than Topuria. I think he uses his kicks a lot more. Topuria's not really a big kicker. He's kind of just a pressure boxer. I can see Aldo just slashing him with those leg kicks. Just doing enough to outstrike him across a couple of rounds, and I think I'd probably pick Aldo to win this one by decision, so I'm going to go to Aldo by decision. Prime Jose Aldo that was destroying the likes of Uriah Faber and Cub Swanson. I've got to go with Jose Aldo beating current Topuria. Now, Topuria against prime Conor McGregor, a fight that gets talked about a lot. Now, McGregor nowadays is kind of just known for being this guy who got smashed back at got his leg broken, went to these parties, these court cases, a bunch of stuff, a bunch of problems that he's having to deal with. But if we're talking about featherweight McGregor, the undefeated featherweight McGregor that was on an absolute tear, the McGregor that made us all fans of him, this dude was a monster as well. Knocked out prime Jose Aldo, was just so slick and accurate on the feet. It's almost as if he was a machine made for accurately just picking people apart. He'd have the perfect range for everything. He'd keep people in the perfect distance. And he's a completely different guy to the McGregor that nowadays is. Like, you look at McGregor in interviews nowadays compared to back then, it's a completely different guy. And like we just said, we know that Topuria doesn't really do well against kicks. We saw it against Holloway, even against Jai Herbert. His entire UFC career, Topuria kind of struggles. His only big flaw is big kickers. And we know that McGregor in his prime was an amazing kicker at range. He'd be an amazing kicker. On top of that, the press conference as well. Would Conor McGregor get in the head of elite Topuria? Would he rile up Topuria to make silly mistakes in the fight because of, rounding him up? But I think round 1 to 3, I'd probably favour Conor McGregor. I think he'd bob in and out at the perfect time, land the perfect shots in elite Topuria, keep him at range with kicks, as we've seen Topuria struggle with in the past. And I think McGregor would win the first 3. Now, if it does get into the later rounds, round 4 and round 5, that's where I'd favour Topuria. We know he's got good stamina. We saw in that Josh Emmett fight, it was roughing him up later on. I think Topuria's definitely got the stamina in the fight. And we even saw against Chad Mendes in a 3-rounder how McGregor struggles with the grappling of Chad Mendes. So I think McGregor wins by a close decision. I think the later rounds would go to Topuria, but early on, I think in the first 3, I'd favour McGregor. I think he bounces in and out at the perfect time, lands a bunch of good kicks on him, keeps him at range, picks him apart on the feet, and then eventually later on in the fight, that's where Topuria roughs him up. But I think McGregor, prime Conor McGregor, undefeated in the featherweight division, how good he was and how far ahead he was in the featherweight division, knocking out Aldo in 13 seconds. I think McGregor wins this one by decision. And then for Zabit Magomedsharipov. Now, I know that Zabit isn't necessarily a GOAT of the featherweight division, but we've already seen him against Holloway. We've already seen him against Volkanovski, Topuria. So let's do it in a bit of a fun matchup, Zabit. Now, Zabit, he kind of reminds me of Mauricio Hufi nowadays. He was just so crafty and unorthodox with everything he threw. Amazing kicker, again, a problem for Topuria because of how good his kicks were. He used it a lot. And we know that Topuria doesn't really do well against heavy kickers. Very unique and unorthodox on the feet, and it worked. And we saw him against Calvin Kattar, a pressure boxer, and he actually did really well against Calvin Kattar. But I will say about Zabit, he does have dodgy stamina. It looked like in that fight with Calvin Kattar, as the fight went on, his stamina kind of got a little bit worse, and that's where I think Topuria could capitalize and potentially TKO him later on in the fight. So I'd probably go with Ilie Topuria to TKO Zabit later on in the fight. I think Zabit could do well early on with the striking if Topuria couldn't get him against the cage and knock him out, which he definitely has a chance of doing. But I think the longer the fight goes on, it favours Topuria, and I don't think Topuria's going to get finished early on. I reckon Topuria would finish him later on because Zabit, dodgy stamina. Topuria probably find a way to take him down and just batter him with ground and pound, in my opinion. And then for the Bantamweight division with Merab, the first one we've got is Dominic Cruz. Dominic Cruz versus Merab. Apparently nowadays this is a conversation of who is the Bantamweight GOAT between the two of them. I've always thought it was Cruz, but apparently now Merab's an argument. Well, there's an argument that Merab's the greatest of all time now. Merab, obviously, really high-level wrestler, has basically been able to dominate every single wrestler or every single fighter that he's got against with his wrestling. Just dominating people with his wrestling, taking people down, holding them against the cage, and just spamming takedowns. But he's facing Dominic Cruz, who has elite takedown defense and elite striking as well. He's quite a bad matchup stylistically, actually, for Merab. We've seen him have amazing wrestling in the past offensively and even defensively for Dominic Cruz. We know he's a good wrestler, and he has got, like I just said, an 83% takedown defense record. In his prime, his takedown defense was insane. In that fight with Uriah Faber, how he was able to keep it on the feet. We've seen him against the likes of Demetrius Johnson and Cody Garbrandt, how he's been able to keep the fight on the feet and keep the fight standing. And on the feet, he's just really good defensively, and he's definitely a better striker than Merab. So I'd probably have to go with him. I mean, Merab isn't like most of the other wrestlers that we've seen in the UFC recently. He doesn't really favour control time. He's more of an output grappler, which if anything is going to favour Dominic Cruz, who's got good takedown defense. So I'd go Cruz to win this one by decision. I think he keeps the fight on the feet. I'm not saying he doesn't get taken down at all. I think there would be times when Merab takes him down, but Merab tends to let people off after a minute or two. And I think Cruz would have a good enough takedown defense throughout the entire fight, and he'd pick him apart on the feet. I'd go prime Dominic Cruz, who was just cruising through the Bantamweight division, no pun intended, to win this one by decision. So I'm going to go Dominic Cruz. And then for TJ Dillashaw, I ain't talking about the TJ Dillashaw that showed up against Sterling. I'm talking about prime, roided up TJ Dillashaw. He was one of the most dangerous. He was so dangerous in his prime, was TJ Dillashaw. He had scary KO power. He was just putting people to sleep everywhere. But he did struggle with wrestling, I will say. We've seen throughout his career, Dillashaw has kind of struggled with wrestlers. And you put him in against Merab, who has dominated so many people with wrestling. I think it goes very similar to the O'Malley fight. O'Malley, being TJ Dillashaw, would have moments on the feet. He'd be dangerous on the feet. But the majority of the fight would be Merab controlling the fight with his wrestling. So I'd probably go Merab to win this one by decision. As dangerous as TJ Dillashaw was, he would definitely have his moments on the feet. He'd definitely be the scary guy on the feet. But we've seen him struggle with the grappling in the past. You put him against one of the best wrestlers Bantamweight I've ever seen. I think Merab probably wins this one by decision, similar to the O'Malley fighting stylistically. You know, TJ's dangerous on the feet, not the best grappler. I'd go Merab win this one by decision. And then for Aljamain Sterling, a training partner of Merab, very close guy who would never fight. But if these guys were to fight, it's tough because they're both very similar in the sense that they're both high-level grapplers, but they're also trash strikers. They've got a very similar style that they kind of share in the octagon. Now, they have had 3 mutual opponents, which we can kind of base this on. I mean, first of all, Peter Yan. When you look at Sterling against Peter Yan, he kind of just backpacked him the entire fight and took him to a very, very controversial decision. But when Merab fought Yan, he dominated him and beat him from pillar to post with his wrestling. He absolutely dominated him in one of the most dominating performances in bantamweight history. So that's how they did against Peter Yan. Against Cejudo, you know, Sterling, he out-grappled him for the majority of the fight. Whereas when Merab fought him, he was picking him up, having fun with him, and easily won the fight. So I think Merab had a better performance against Cejudo as well. And then for Sean O'Malley, I mean, Sterling got KO'd out, caught by Sean O'Malley, and Merab beat him by decision with the wrestling. So I think it's fair to say that the Merab's probably the better wrestler out of the two of them. I think he's shown that he's got better pressure wrestling, but I think Sterling's the better grappler. If anyone's going to get a submission or take you back, it's going to be Sterling, but if anyone's going to take you down, it's probably going to be Merab. But how they fare against each other, it is a tough one. It is a tough one to call, but because they both suck at striking as well. That's the thing. Both of these guys suck at striking. It's a fairly 50-50 fight in my opinion. I couldn't tell you how this fight goes. I don't think Merab just dominates Sterling with wrestling. I don't think Sterling can dominate Merab with wrestling. I can't really say if any of them are better on the feet than the other. It's a 50-50 fight in my opinion. Either of them could get the win. They're very evenly matched. And then for Pantoja in the flyweight division, the first one I've got is the greatest flyweight of all time in Demetrius Johnson. How would Demetrius Johnson do against Pantoja? Now, Demetrius Johnson, he had elite Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, he had elite wrestling, he had elite striking, one of the most well-rounded fighters we've ever seen. And I think he's pound for pound the greatest fighter in UFC history. I'm not saying he's the GOAT, I'm saying he's pound for pound the most skilled fighter, in my opinion, the UFC's ever seen. You put him against Pantoja. Now, Pantoja's good, but he seems to be having these close fights with people that he shouldn't really be having close fights with. But I will say, in favor of Pantoja, the current flyweight division is way tougher than the flyweight division that was around when Demetrius Johnson was champ. Like, if Pantoja was fighting the same guys that DJ was fighting, he'd be beating all of those guys, in my opinion, or at least most of those guys. Now, for DJ, he's got good takedown defense to Demetrius Johnson, good striking. I think he'd find a TKO. Pantoja, he's got a good chin. He's an absolute dog, but he's way too vulnerable for my liking against somebody like Demetrius Johnson, who figures everybody out. I think Demetrius Johnson, later on in the fight, when Pantoja's scrapping, I think Demetrius Johnson could find a way to take him down, beat him with ground and pound. Maybe not take him down, but just find a shot on the feet. I'd probably go Demetrius Johnson to find a way to beat him by TKO. Tough fight for Pantoja. Not an easy fight for Demetrius Johnson because Pantoja's a scrapper and he is a modern-day champion, but I'd think Demetrius Johnson would find a way to TKO Pantoja, in my opinion. And then for John Dodson, bit of an odd flyweight to pick, but John Dodson was dangerous in his day. He was a very, very powerful striker, one of the hardest hitting flyweights we've ever seen, and he's got good takedown defense. Merab barely took down John Dodson in their fight. John Dodson's got good grappling, he's always shown. So it's a tough one to call. And on top of that, the striking of John Dodson, like, he's very powerful, like I just said. He actually dropped Peter Yan at one point, which is bad for Pantoja because Pantoja usually runs in with these shots and leaves his chin wide open to be countered. But I would go with Pantoja to win this one by decision. As good as John Dodson is, I think Pantoja, you look at the flyweight resume that he's got, the amount of styles that he's beaten, I don't think John Dodson would be the guy to beat him. And he's got a great chin. Pantoja's probably got the best chin right now in the flyweight division. So I think Pantoja probably gets dropped once or twice, but the majority of the fight would be Pantoja just beating John Dodson with the grappling. I'd go Pantoja to win this one by decision. And I'm not going to talk about the other bantamweight, the other flyweight goals, because Davison Figueiredo and Brandon Moreno, he's already beaten those guys. But that is how I would match every current UFC champion against the all-time greats. Let me know your thoughts on this, and if you agree, disagree. Thank you for watching.